Tonight, we have a guest teacher, my close friend, my brother, and all around brilliant man, Carlos Garrido, who wrote what I consider one of the central contributions to American Marxism, the analysis of what we call the purity fetish. Today, we're going to take all of the sort of Marxist building blocks we've learned over the last 8 weeks and put them to use in analyzing how the world is today. Editing the book on the purity fetish is maybe one of the most important things I've done in my life. I'm not joking about that. I can't praise this theory enough. And we're going to get started real quick right after this.
Cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
All right, welcome back. There are a few announcements I want to make before we get into the lecture for tonight. First and foremost, everyone in the class, if you were planning on writing your paper on where you were with Marxism and where you are now, make sure you get those done because they're not due next week, but the week after that. And speaking of next week, I guess, next week's class is going to be on reproletarianization. Another thing we at the Institute believe is a central part of understanding American Marxism. All that said, though, that's it. Take it away, Carlos. I know everyone's really excited for this class.
Hello, everyone. I have also been looking forward to discussing with you on the subject of the purity fetish. It's a weird little moment when you're in the Zoom and not in the StreamYard because it feels like a 1 minute and 17 seconds moment of silence for the international. But yeah, so the purity fetish. What's interesting about the purity fetish is that it's developed in October of 2021 while focusing in on one specific form that I saw the purity fetish taking. And then it's concretized beyond that in the subsequent years, and especially in the book, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, in a way that's also very much influenced by the conversations that I've had with Noah, with Eddie, with Tom, and with other folks from the Institutes and friends of the Institute, scholars that we constantly have on and stuff. And the various other forms that I saw the purity fetish taking were all somehow connected to like the reason why we founded the Midwestern Marx Institute in the first place, and like the very immediate, almost like surface level, but I think intuitively correct analysis of what was wrong with the left, that in such a moment pregnant with such revolutionary potential, it seemed like nothing substantially was going on. And, you know, there was mobilization after mobilization where millions of people would hit the streets and nothing would come out of it. They would just go back to work the following week. And, you know, the most you could say that came out of it, out of something like BLM, was like the election of Biden, which what has came out of that, right? More of the same In fact, in some areas, a little bit worse than what we had before. We're at the precipice of, as you all know, almost a World War III catastrophic nuclear annihilational moment. And, it was seen, at least at the time, after these massive protests, that in terms of numbers were the largest we've seen in American history. Some estimates say around 30 million-ish. Um, what came out of it? And it was really nothing. And then if we look at really the protests against the war in Iraq, something similar, the Occupy Wall Street movement, something similar, the Bernie Sanders progressive movement, something similar. And, so that's the environment that Eddie and myself are in as activists and organizers. And we're trying to figure out what the hell is going wrong. And we come up with a variety of different theses. And those theses ends up then being like retaken up with the analysis of the purity fetish. But let me back up a little bit before I get to like the various forms that it takes and the connection that has to how it was that we founded the institute and the purposes behind that. One of the central things that I know you all have been doing in this class is learning the Marxist worldview. And the Marxist worldview at its essence is dialectical materialism. And I think that while there's a lot of Marxist scholarship that tries to obscure what that means and what that worldview entails, fundamentally, a lot of its central premises and the ways that it observes the world, some of the central assumptions are already in popular common sense consciousness. And let me just name a few, which are not necessarily unique to Marxism itself, which are present as far back as the philosophy of Heraclitus. Everything is in constant change and motion and transformation. So there's nothing that's static in this world. Everything is in a constant state of motion. And that was a very revolutionary position that was taken by Heraclitus as opposed to other philosophers that were arguing that to take change as a reality is to go down the path of falsity and opinion, that truth is connected to that which is unchanging. And in general, the history of philosophy has treated the question of truth, specifically Western philosophy, has treated the question of truth and of universals in a similar fashion. Like, what is universal is that which stays the same across space and time. So one of the central postulates is universal change, which is something that we think is observable, very clearly observable in nature, in human society, and in thinking, which are all different forms that nature takes because we're natural beings as well. And that gets at, again, part of the essence of a phrase which I know that Noah has mentioned a few times from Engels, which is that nature is a test of dialectics, right? We don't have to foist these ideas onto nature by observing nature and being open to the way in which change is constant in it and other principles that I'll get to now. Nature itself gets us this way of viewing the world. There's objective dialectics, like the way that these principles actually occur in the world. And then there's subjective dialectics, which is us coming to be subjectively aware of these of this dialectical character of the world in our minds and thought. So that's one of the first principles that I know you guys have covered. Another one is universal interconnection. Along with the fact that everything is in constant change, everything is also in constant interconnection with everything else. And it's in interconnections, not just in this void, in this sort of empty void, but it exists within totalities, within the given wholes in which the interconnections take place and in which the interconnections are both shaping of the whole and the trajectory of the whole and the totality, but reciprocally shaped by the whole itself. And a term that has developed in philosophy for this sort of reciprocal interaction that allows the whole to then influence the parts is emergentism. And there's quite a few examples of that. One of the ones that Jeeves and Brown
I
went out
cheated.
in their book on. Huh?
Took a peek at Greg and Hillary's video. She's fine. The baby's
Ed, it
fine.
looks like you are unmuted, my friend.
Thank you for taking a peek.
So emergentism is it's a category that leading neuroscientists have been using, and leading some philosophers of mine have been using. And it simply describes the way in which certain properties cannot be reduced to parts that exist within a whole. That when things come into the form of a specific form of totality, that totality then reciprocally allows new properties to arise, to emerge, that are not reducible to the whole, that are not reducible to any of its parts or to the aggregate of the parts. And a good example of that is ants. Like um, when ants form in colonies, they're able to think in ways in which individual ants can't. They're able to locate the closest food source to the colony and do all these various sorts of activities that as individual ants they cannot do. There's a new emergent property that arises from the totality that cannot be pinned down to any specific part within that totality itself. And this has been used to describe thinking. And one of the first people that used this to describe the conundrum of thought, how is it that material beings can have such a thing as thought, that we can't really point to a specific part in our brain and say, oh, that's thought, was Engels. Engels describes thought as this emergent property of highly organized matter, right? And generally, some of the most advanced segments of neuroscience and the interactions that neuroscience has had with the philosophy of mind have tended to agree on the character of thinking and thought as an emergent property, or consciousness as an emergent property of highly organized matter. And that's why you can't reduce it to any particular part of the brain, because it emerges from the whole. So I got a little bit off the tracks there, but I think it's important to note that. But so you have universal motion, universal interconnection. That's both are taking place within totalities. And then you have an understanding that things and processes are not homogeneous. And by this I mean, because I know the term itself, homogeneous, is ambiguous. One definition is like just sameness. That's not what I mean. What I mean by homogeneous is sort of the other definition, which is not allowing of internal plurality. So containing within itself uniformity, right? And it's important to note that within everything and within every process, within every totality, there is plurality. There's the many. The many exists within the one. And the way that this manifests itself specifically in the dialectical materialist worldview is the understanding, and in dialectics in general, from Heraclitus to Hegel, is the understanding that it is contradiction and the tension that exists between that unity of opposites, that unity, that identity and difference that exists within things and within processes that drives that movement. So those are really the sort of three central premises of dialectics: universal movement, universal interconnection, and contradiction, not as, in the way that it meant for a big chunk of philosophy, falsehood, right? Where if you arrived at contradiction, if you discovered contradiction, it was assumed that, oh, you're wrong. You're wrong about something because you got to a contradictory point. In some cases, that still holds, but you have for instance, the case of Zeno of Elea, who makes the argument that a very famous argument. He makes a few variations of it. Aristotle says that he makes 4 variations, but he makes the argument that in order to get from point A to point B, you have to go halfway. And to go from point A to that halfway point, you need to go halfway, and halfway, and halfway, and halfway, and halfway, and halfway. And the argument that he ends up making, it's something called ad infinitum. There has to be an infinite number of halfway points that have to be traversed by a finite being. And that is a contradiction. And so he said change is an illusion. And this was a form of him defending Parmenides, one of the key thinkers in ancient Greece, defending the view that the world is one, that does not allow for internal plurality, contradiction is falsehood, change is an illusion. But what Hegel notes in this what's called Zeno's paradox, and when in the various forms that they take, is that what he ends up doing is discovering contradiction. And instead of treating this as an amazing breakthrough in the history of thought, the role that change, that thing which we literally see all the time everywhere, is propelled by contradiction, as an internal contradiction within it. Instead of treating that as a discovery, he treated that which he discovered as a sign of the falsity of change, right? So uh, these sort of three principles are in contradistinction to some of the central philosophical assumptions held in the history of philosophy. And just to repeat the three: universal change, interconnection, and the role of contradiction. Now, as in the Hegelian and then in the Marxist dialectical materialist tradition, that's concretized a little more. We look for certain patterns that change takes. We call those the laws of dialectics. I know that Noah has covered these in previous classes: unity and struggle of opposites, negation of the negation, quantity to quality. It's also a way of rethinking the traditional categories in philosophy. So again, I talked a little bit about the category of emergence. That is itself a way of rethinking the relationship of parts to whole. We rethink the relationship of the individual to society, rethink the relationship of mind to body. We overcome the dualism that has been assumed in the history of philosophy of thinking and being. And so it's a new way, a radically new way of thinking that is archetypically in its materialist form when it assumes the aspect of matter to be primary. That when something is primary, it doesn't mean that the other side of it can't influence that which is primary. It just means that it holds a certain level of primacy in the fact that it determines that which then determines it in a reciprocal fashion. But the point that I'm trying to get at is that it's a radically new worldview. And when you call yourself a Marxist, what you're effectively should be saying is that this is the worldview through which you view the world. At the most abstract level, this is like how you approach the world. And then that gets concretized in your study of nature, in your study of human society. When you apply it to human society and history, it's historical materialism, and in the history of thought, right? But that's the basic level sort of philosophical assumptions that are both of an ontological character. That means that they make statements about the constitution of how the world actually is, and also of an epistemological character. That means that they make claims about the question of knowledge and how it is that we should best approach the world. And on that latter end, the method that we say is the method of the ascension from the abstract to concrete. We can't know, for instance, to use an example that I know was brought up in the class, we can't know the capitalist system systemically and comprehensively until it has developed, until the totality itself has taken shape and matured. Only then can we apply the method of the ascension from the abstract to the concrete and actually have a concrete reproduction in our heads of the concrete. And when I use the word concrete, people tend to just want to touch stuff, right? The concrete is the stuff that we touch. The abstract is the stuff that's in our head. Philosophers deal in the realm of abstraction. That's not how the term concrete and abstract is used in Hegel and then in Marx. Both Hegel and Marx have identical quotes. Hegel in the Lectures on the History of Philosophy and Marx in the Grundrisse, which are a series of manuscripts before he published his Capital in 1867, where they say the concrete is a unity of many determinations, or diverse determinations. All it means is that the concrete is a unity of many. And what did I say earlier was a sort of synonym for that, the whole, the totality. So the most concrete would be the whole. So if I want to study the capitalist system completely or comprehensively, concretely, it needs to develop and form into a totality. And I need to use this method of going from the abstract, which will here mean things disconnected from everything else, as a sort of starting point to the most concrete. And what you see in Marx's Capital, the 3 volumes, is an ascension from the most basic category of the commodity to other commodities, to other categories, money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in each case, it gets concretized such that you cannot understand the categories at the end of the theoretical section of the first volume or the categories in the third volume without understanding the previous ones. And you also cannot fully understand the early categories without seeing their unfolding. That means how they concretize, how they how something internal within them becomes explicit in the latter ones, right? So it's a both it's one and also the other. It's a reciprocal interaction in order to understand it comprehensively. And I've given the example of like a Bob Ross painting before in videos, which is that if you're not an artist and the sort of person that can just look at a painting and reconstruct in your head how it was that it was painted, Bob Ross in his 30 minutes of painting really helps you understand how it is that a painting comes about, because he goes from the most abstract, an empty canvas, to the most concrete, which is the whole painting. And he goes piece by piece, and you see it in motion. You see each brush stroke interconnected to the other brush stroke, and you see all of the characteristic principles of the dialectical worldview in action, while you're, if you reflect on it, seeing yourself as seeing it as a process of going from the abstract to the concrete. So this is at its core dialectical materialism. And what ends up happening, and the reason why the category of the purity fetish ends up being developed, is that I looked at how it was that the Western Marxists have looked at socialist states. That was the first example. And how are they treating it? How do they treat socialist states? Well, they have this definition, this pure definition, this pure idea of what socialism is. And then they measure that pure idea up against the socialist states, and the class struggles that end up conquering political power in the real world, whether it's the USSR, China, Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, whatever the case might be. And then they say, well, the reality doesn't measure up to my pure idea. And because it doesn't measure up, it cannot actually be socialism, right? They're unable, in doing so, what they're unable to do is think through socialism as a process, that is see how it is that socialism is not this static thing, but something that's in constant motion. The one time that Marx and Engels explicitly say they say communism is the real movement of history which abolishes the present state of things. So they're unable to do that, see things in their motion. They're unable to see socialism these socialist states in their interconnection. So they can't place it in the global capitalist imperialist system in which it existed and which affects it, because it is interconnected to it. They're unable to see the natural role of contradictions. They'll observe certain contradictions within socialist states and see that things are not perfect or ideal, and because of that, they're going to reject it without failing to reflect on the fact that if they actually believe or investigate concretely what they're looking at, they have to see that contradictions are universal. They exist everywhere, in nature and in society and in thought. And that doesn't mean that socialism has been disproven because there's contradictions. Uh, it's absurd. We should avoid antagonistic contradictions, which is a category that is developed further by Mao. The contradictions will always appear in every social system because they appear everywhere. And it's again a result of the fact that we're talking about a many that exists within the one and that propels the movement of that one, of that totality. And so they're unable to, for instance, think about the ways in which the concept in German Aufhebung, in English is usually translated to sublation or supersession sometimes. The way that implies that socialism in its earliest stages or in its transitional stages, in its earliest transitional forms, is going to have to always contain elements of the previous order. Marx talks about this as like the birthmarks of the previous orders. There's a million different ways Lenin even calls it like a hybrid of like the proletariat and socialism with political power, and then hybrid because there's like state capitalism or state socialism, and there's capitalist enterprise. And so they're unable to see how socialism is going to necessarily have a little bit of the old social order, just like capitalism has a little bit of the old social order and contains it within it, because the way that things change is not by fully breaking with that which was previous to it, but by preserving a part of it and canceling another part. This is what sublation means. You cancel a part of it and you preserve and elevate into the new thing another part of the rational kernel in the old. So the Western Marxists have never been able to see this in socialism, and at its root has been a fundamentally anti-dialectical way of examining socialist countries. And that's sort of the negative formulation. They lack dialectics. There's that famous phrase from the 1890s, I think 1892 letter to Conrad Schmidt, where Engels says, "What all these men lack is dialectics." The way that I formulate the positive form of that, like the form of thinking that can be positively defined in the form of the absence of dialectics, is the purity fetish. Why do they do that? Well, because they cannot think through contradictions, they cannot think through change, um, they cannot think through interconnection, and they fail in all of these spheres precisely because they treat the things that they approach through a form that says, here's the pure idea, almost like a Platonic ideal. And if reality doesn't measure up to that, I'm going to reject it. And that is the purity fetish, an incessant obsession with purity, such that judgment in the real world is determined by whether or not the thing you're looking at achieves that purity. If it does, then you can support it. If it doesn't, then you can't. But what ends up happening is that you just can't be neutral in a moving train, as Howard Zinn used to say. So in doing that, they end up becoming what I call in the book agents of a controlled counter hegemony. They end up becoming the fake left, or in Gabriel Rocco's terms, the radical recuperators, and Lukács's terms, the sort of people that propel an indirect apologetics of the system. There's a variety of different ways that you can call it, but essentially they're just a compatible left. They don't substantially threaten capitalism because they consider the alternatives capitalist imperialism is actively fighting against, but not actually be an alternative. And in many instances, they consider it to be far worse. So they end up in this sort of Thatcherite position where they accept there is no alternative. We're in this Winston Churchill style position where they say capitalism is the worst system except for all the other ones. And they end up treating capital, the dominant order, objectively, like Leibniz would treat God, where the question comes up, well, how can there be God and evil at the same time, and all these different things if God is all knowing, all powerful, and all loving? And the answer is like, yeah, but this is the best of all possible worlds. If you think this world is bad, the other ones are worse. And that's what the Western Marxists end up doing with capitalism, right? They think socialism is far worse, and a lot of them equate it with fascism and Nazism. Then capitalism is the best of all possible alternatives. And so that's one of the paradoxes within the purity fetish, that there's always gaps and within that sort of logic of I'm only going to pass judgment on the basis of whether a thing measures up to its purity or not. And objectively, they side with imperialism. They wouldn't say this explicitly, but objectively, they do. The function that they play is precisely that. It's one of recuperating the people, which in times of crisis, they're like, my life is hard. How do I change this? And if they had a strong communist party, they would have the answers to why it is hard and how to change it. But instead, they have these sorts of clowns that are propped up by the Western Academy and by the NGOs and by the media, and that have this whole elaborate political economy of knowledge that funds them with millions and billions of dollars, journals, publications, magazines, teaching positions, all sorts of stuff in order for those people to be the official counter hegemony. And they want it like that because they know that they're controlling it. They don't substantially oppose capitalist imperialism. And there's material reasons for this. the funding, their class position in the petty bourgeoisie, and in the intelligentsia, and at the ideological level, what the purity fetish does is allow us to see what is their outlook. What do all these different people who take different forms in the way that they mess up and end up siding with imperialism at the end of the day, how are they themselves interconnected to each other? And the way that all these different mistakes that we see in the Western Marxists or in American Marxists, etc., the way that they're all interconnected, or in Trotskyites, is through the purity fetish, through, again, this incessant approach to the world that if things do not measure up to their ideal, perfect, pure idea, they're going to reject it. They fetishize the pure idea and leave the world and its meanness and its contradictory character and its procedural nature and its interconnectedness. They leave all of that behind in favor of this pure, static idea that allows of no internal contradiction, no interconnection, and no movement. So that takes two additional forms, I argue in the book, in American Marxists. One of which is the rejection of their national past, which is really what Georgy Dimitrov called in 1935 national nihilism. They look back at their past, they see it as impure because it is impure. They reject it completely, right? That's the nihilism part. They're saying no to their national past. And what ends up happening when they do that is that they end up participating in a form of liberal American exceptionalism. Everywhere else in the world, socialism has been the content which has taken a specific national form. You remove the jargon, all that really means is that socialism is going to take root in a way that resembles the traditions, the history, and the culture of the people in which it is taking root in, the people that won the struggle for political power and that are now constructing socialism. And this comes from a very basic dialectical law, or really dialectical understanding of the categorical interaction between universal and particular. Whereas old school Western philosophy saw the universal here, the particular here, were divided by an unbridgeable gulf. Dialectical philosophy, dialectical thinking says that no, there could be no universal divorced from the particular. What makes something universal is its ability to take different forms, different particular forms over time. And so we juxtapose to that abstract universal, rootless universal philosophy, a rooted in concrete universal. When you apply this to socialism, again, it means that it always has to take a particular form, a particular concrete form. And the American Marxists that have this form of national nihilism, the rejection of the past, they're unable to see that. And so they end up in a position where, yeah, socialism in Russia can take Russian forms, in China, Chinese characteristics, in Cuba, Cuban characteristics, in Venezuela, Bolivarian socialism, in Africa, Pan-African socialism. But we, the virtuous Americans, we have the capacity to just say no to all of our traditions and reduce our country's history to slavery, settler colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is fundamentally incorrect, right? It's a one-sided view of American history. We have in the underbelly of that horrible, evil history, a history of struggles, a history of people's struggles against racism, against sexism, for socialism, against imperialism, for peace, the history of the labor movement. It's such a rich history of struggle, which you would understand has to necessarily exist wherever there's oppression, wherever there's exploitation, there's going to be struggles. So one of the things, and here I want to mention this, the purity fetish, not only, I'll give the third form and then I'll make this point. So that's the second form that the purity fetish takes in the US. The third form is the way that they have been approaching, especially since the Trump phenomenon and the development of, what some people have called Trump derangement syndrome, the part of the working class that decided to vote for Trump, oftentimes, as someone who's organized in the Midwest, because of the fact that they saw him as someone who was going to drain the swamp. Now we know that's not true. We've experienced in the 4 years that he was president the fact that that wasn't true. But the instinct was still radical. I want something new. I'm tired of the established order. And it is only the communists who can actually give them the world in which they would be dignified in living in. Not Trump, not the Democrats, not any of the bourgeois parties. However, in the face of this contradiction and their inability to see these contradictions, a big chunk of the left just reduced this group of people to being fascist, racist, unorganizable basket of deplorables. And the Hillary Clinton's horrible phrase. Um, so what happens there? How is the purity fetish connected to that? Well, they have this pure idea of the sort of enlightened social ideals that the working class must have in order to be organized. And if they don't measure up to that, if they don't have the most advanced position on trans issues or something, or on whatever issue, on issues of foreign policy, whatever the case might be, if they don't have the most advanced positions, then you cannot organize them. And that effectively means that as a JB, I don't know if he's here today, I don't think he's here, but JB gave me this analogy, which I use in the book. It means that communists are reduced to preaching to the choir. We're reduced to the sorts of people that can only ever talk to the people that already agree with us, right? Because if we say to people that have imperfect views, we're not going to organize you, and you're beyond our reach of what's organizable, who are we talking to? Just the small insular spaces that we are already in. We can win socialism like that. The task of communists is to be able to go to the working classes, not because they're already socialists or because they're Democrats or because they're Republicans. You go to the working class because of their class position. Their material objective position in society makes them revolutionary. And wherever they are ideologically, you figure out the ways to get what is rational in their outlook and reorient it, rearticulate it to socialism, dislocate it from the current outlook that they have, and relocate it in a socialist, class conscious outlook. You can't do that if you're rejecting the Trump part of the working class because they're too impure. So, in every instance, in every form that the purity fetish takes in the US and in the West in general, you find not only the inability to actually understand the world and to grasp truth, right? So it's in my view, at least, a deeply anti-philosophical way of looking at the world, because philosophy is embedded in the conquest and the striving for truth. They can't grasp truth. They can't understand things correctly, precisely because they're not dialectical. They can't see things concretely. They miss everything that I already mentioned of what dialectics was and why it's a better way of looking at the world that allows you to understand it better. They're not only not able to understand the world, they're completely unable to have a revolution and to organize for socialism. And it's not a coincidence that these people who spend all their time condemning socialism, who within the first 5 to 10 pages of their books, they're criticizing Stalinism and China and this and that and all socialist experiments, calling them not real socialism. It's not a coincidence. It's these people haven't done anything. What revolution have they produced? From what moral high ground are they speaking from? They haven't produced anything. And these things are not disconnected. What the purity fetish allows us to do is see them in their interconnection, see the different forms that they take, and how in every instance, they're not only unable to grasp truth, but also unable to build a revolutionary movement. If you reject your national past in the US, you're not going to be able to find in the common sense of the American people the rational kernels that you can use to dislocate the outlook that they have and relocate those rational kernels to socialism. That means you can't convince people. You cannot win the war of positions, as Gramsci, would call it, the war of hegemony, the war of ideas, whatever you want to call it. You cannot win if you're already disconnecting yourself from the common sense of the American people, which is embedded in their history, right? That's one example. If you accept all the anti-communist bullshit that the ruling class and its McCarthyite agents have fed the American people about communism, and if you go up to them and say, yeah, we're going to fight for communism, but the Soviet Union and China and all these countries, they were so horrible, and there was genocides and there was famine and it was poverty and et cetera, dictatorship, totalitarian. If that's your approach, the working class person you're talking to has to be a complete idiot to say, you know what, I trust you. I trust you. I'm going to go with you. Because when you do that, the approach, what you're saying effectively is all of these people in the global South and East that have tried socialism, They all failed. But we, the virtuous West or the virtuous Americans, we're the ones that are going to get it right. And no one buys into that. It's much more effective as an organizing strategy to show how they have been lied to, why the people that lied to them have an interest in keeping them ignorant about the gains of socialism, and then what the gains of socialism, even under the boot of imperialist hybrid warfare in every instance, from the first experiment, Russia gets invaded after its revolution by 17 countries, the US, the UK, Japan, France included. From the start, they attack us with everything they got. And we've still been able to develop so much and lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, give them dignified lives in every socialist experiment up to date. Every single socialist experiment has done that. If we take that message to the working class in our country, we will be much more effective at convincing them to fight for socialism than if we accept the lies of empire because we have the purity fetish outlook. And the last point, if we don't organize a big chunk of the working class that has imperfect views, I mean, that's kind of self-evident. Like, who the hell are you going to organize? Who are you going to bring to your side? If a big chunk of the population, you're in an a priori fashion before even engaging with them, saying they're unorganizable. So this is the analysis of the purity fetish. It's grounded really on many people who have had similar insights, and I'm trying to systematize it, and I've tried to systematize it in as best a form as I can. There's various similar concepts that have arisen, and of course quotes that appear in the classics that point to an understanding of this and a critique of the purity fetish. And what I try to do is sort of connect all of that in a way that helps us understand the world today, why it is that the left is failing in such a revolutionarily pregnant moment, and how it is that we can move forward. And I think that entails doing the sort of stuff that we're doing now, educating people on the dialectical materialist outlook, and preparing so that within a few years, we can be more effective in organizing and be able to seize the objective revolutionary conditions of our moment. It's wrong to assume that just because things get hard, revolution is guaranteed. That's a fatalistic understanding, and that has no role in Marxism. Freedom and necessity, or freedom and determinism, are in a dialectical relationship to the other. Things can get as bad as they want. Our moment could be as pregnant with revolution as it wants. But if people don't do, things can get as bad as they want. But if people don't do what's required of them in the moment, if they don't freely take up the task of being the agents of history and functioning in this form that Hegel called the cunning of reason, where your individual will lines up with the will of history. If we don't do that as individuals, no revolution is going to come about. Or in the words of Lenin, no order, regardless of how much it wobbles, will topple on its own. It's up to us to do it. And I think the purity fetish is a way that we can understand why we failed and how we can move forward. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, brother. I think that was a brilliant encapsulation of the theory of the purity fetish.